One of the aims of the African Union's Agenda 2063 is to end all wars and violent conflicts on the continent by, among other things, promoting dialogue-based mechanisms for conflict prevention and resolution. Now, the lead project of Agenda 2063 was silencing the guns in Africa by 2020. This didn't happen, and sadly a number of old conflicts have continued and new ones have begun. To talk about what might be a way forward is Professor of Conflict Resolution and Peacebuilding at the George Mason University School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, Professor Mohammed Chekaoui. I spoke to him soon after a conference here in South Africa on the UN Security Council, the Elected 10, and Africa's peace and security architecture. Mohammed Chekaoui, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us on the program. Welcome to you.
Good to be with you.
Professor, I know that you've been at a conference recently looking at conflict resolution and prevention. I just wonder, when we look at Africa, the African Union and its various regional bodies, do we have the apparatus and the architecture to prevent conflict and to resolve it when it occurs?
Well, first of all, there is a whole host of reasons why we don't see this effectiveness or efficiency of our African Union institutions in addressing conflicts. In 2020, Africa was the sole continent where political violence rose in comparison with 2019. In this continent, at least 18 states, 1/3 of the countries in Africa where you have state forces are part of the dilemma of political violence. So I would say we have a dilemma of normativity and realism. In other words, we have established several institutions that should stop this political violence, but at the same time, we have not tackled the issue of when these member states remain committed to those principles and go through the process of mediation, negotiation, all sorts of diplomacy. In other words, there are certain capitals who are there just for a public discourse purpose, but at the same time, they rely more on the United Nations than the African Union. At the same time, we have a problem with what is the unit of analysis in terms of the African continent. Is it a state? Is it the militia? Is it the rebel group? Is it the mercenaries? We have several agents that are committing these different forms of political violence. However, at the structural or at the institutional level in Addis Ababa, we only focus on states. And I think there is a similar dilemma also in New York. We have not incorporated yet non-state actors. So we are now looking at half of the screen, if you like, or part of reality, and we have not figured out that if we don't contain those non-state actors, especially rebel groups, and find other mechanisms of resolution and at least conflict transformation, then we are not going to make much progress. So we end up repeating our normative approach and avoiding attacking or addressing our realistic, I'm talking about political realism, which is interest and competition, and even when people and groups resort to violence.
All right, so if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is that the apparatus is there by and large, the architecture is there, it is lacking in some areas. Then the question becomes, for example, let's say there are state actors that are in conflict. Sudan is an example, Ethiopia is an example. What then is holding back the African Union and its regional bodies from dealing decisively with these issues?
In a nutshell, what is lacking is a genuine political will on the level of all stakeholders. And in most of our African conflicts, there are direct parties that we can identify, but there are also indirect other parties. Also, there is a tendency toward relying on some either regional or international support. So when you have these international linkages, these conflicts become protracted. You can identify when they started, but you cannot predict when they will end. And I think one good example is the dam conflict between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. That should have been a good case success story of a conflict resolution mechanism under the auspices of the African Union. But when you look at the position of Addis Ababa, for example, it did not want to have an African solution. So it's probably we are maybe facing a dilemma of political schizophrenia when we go to these meetings and we like to make our speeches, but at the same time, we don't accept the suggested frameworks of analysis and resolution. Therefore, it's a catch-22.
We'll talk a little bit about what might be contributing to that, because I suspect international interests may be at hand. But let's start with the UN, the United Nations, the UN Security Council in particular. Is there a need for reform there, a more permanent and perhaps greater African representation, so that the world's body may be more focused on African issues?
Definitely, and it's high time we shift from power politics and power representation at the level of the Security Council into another mechanism that is based on humanity, on real challenges worldwide. We are now in an era of corona and decline of economic growth and so much fear we have. We don't have a pure human dimension. I've just published a chapter in a book earlier this year on calling for a new UN covenant, in a way that the format, we have 5 permanent members versus 10 elected non-permanent members. This doesn't give us the right balance. It's high time we walk away from the structure that was imposed in 1945 at the San Francisco conference right after World War II, and face with some brevity, if you like, and some decisiveness that 2022, 2025 is a different era, and we need to include more voices and widen the scope of this cosmopolitan search for world and security across the world. I feel that at the UN, we are still devoting attention to the power dynamics and the formality of having the Security Council as the only decision maker at 2 different levels, the big ones versus the temporary ones, 5 against 10. At the same time, we keep the annual meetings of the General Assembly just to give certain psychological and some symbolic satisfaction to the remaining members. So this is not how our reality is. And at the same time, as I said earlier, we need also to look seriously at moving beyond the unit of analysis of the state and include other non-state actors and kind of rearrange our world peace engine or research engine to accept that there are new challenges. In other words, we are repeating the 20th century within the 21st century. We have not moved from that historical legacy of 1945.
Perhaps as a lead into my next question, I'll ask you this question about the Security Council, because this veto power often is a problem, because then conflicts don't get resolved if the Chinese, Russian, American, European interests differ. We end up getting caught in the middle sometimes of getting a resolution, because the members on the Security Council can't agree?
When we try to address political violence, that means there is a search for transforming violence into peace. But when we look at the Security Council, we are reproducing that power system. Those who can have a veto versus those who don't have it, therefore they just have to accept it. So what we end up doing is a limited level of conflict transformation, or even not that. Sometimes it's basically conflict management. And we are far away from resolving those conflicts. So, for example, we have 13 peacekeeping missions in Africa and other places. We have, for example, certain missions that are renewed, their mandates are renewed annually. So for the past 30 years, for example, in the case of certain conflicts in North Africa, it's the same process where you have a pen holder that prepares the draft, and it gets negotiated between the big fives most of the time, more than the other 10 non-permanent. And then either you have abstention in the best scenario, or if there is a veto, then it's killed and you don't hear about it. So I think we need to wake up to the reality that power dynamics should not be the only way of having a multiple representation of different approaches, different visions of how to solve this conflicts. Because at the end of the day, under globalization and this cross movement of militias, we are receiving the impact of all these conflicts, even if we are in a different continent, and namely terrorism, extremism, discrimination, and what have you.
Perhaps finally, leading to that question, I did want to ask about the role of the wider international community, particularly after the colonial era, the Sino, Franco, Anglo, Luso, and maybe even Arab influence that continues to this day. How much of a hand is there in our conflicts and some of the challenges that we have on our continent even now?
Well, unfortunately, there is not much hope in talking about an African or an Arab or even an Asian representation. I mean, China does not consider itself the custodian or the moral leader of Asia. In Africa, we don't have a single voice. So the problem here is that sometimes at the UN, certain diplomats, and I would recall the example of the Hutu and Tutsi conflict in Rwanda in 1994. Some diplomats or some bureaucrats did not care about sending a small unit, military unit, to do some peacekeeping and avoid the bloodshed. We lost 800,000 people in less than 10 days. So my argument now is that when it would be a high time to push or to put extra pressure on the 5 Ps to accept remodeling or restructuring the Security Council. I don't see that it serves the purpose now, and demography has changed. Complexity of conflict now is getting dense. And I think it's just that I was expecting, for example, that in 2020, once we move a little bit from the closures and the fear and scare of Corona, this dialogue would start and the big fives would accept. I mean, I could see, for example, Japan and Germany and maybe India, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, part of this new structure. Either we have 15 permanent members or another way of accommodating and representing other geographies. But unfortunately, the dilemma is we still have the control and the power mechanism more than anything else. And we have not figured out yet a theory how to address these power dynamics at the highest level of our international system.
Professor Mohammed Chekaoui, Professor of Conflict Resolution and Peacebuilding at the George Mason University School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I wish we could have chatted a bit longer, so many issues. Perhaps we'll be able to do it again sometime in the near future. But for today, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Good to be with you.